Hello, welcome to the EPG Pathshala program in Linguistics. I am Professor Ravinder Gargesh from the Department of Linguistics, University of Delhi. The present module is Linguistic Stylistics and Introduction. In this introduction, we will look at different perspectives to a literary text. We will look at the status of linguistic stylistics. We will look at the basic assumptions of language, and we will also look at the implications for the study of linguistics of literature. So we are going to look at it in a broader sense, and later in later modules we will narrow down the approach. The objective of this module is to introduce you to the discipline of linguistic stylistics by showing the relationship between language and art, and by discussing the nature of stylistics. We need to see what is the relationship between language and art. We need to discuss the nature of the verbal sign in art. We know that linguistics is the discipline about the theory of language, wherein it has developed the methods and tools to study language. Linguistic analysis is generally missing from the analysis of literary texts. What we generally find is that literary texts or literary data is kept out of linguistic analysis. Also, when the English departments study literary texts, they leave out linguistic analysis. Linguistic stylistics is a subdiscipline of linguistics that studies style, particularly in literature. So we will have a discussion on this. We will see how connotative meanings are acquired from the inherent properties of the sign itself. There have been different perspectives to literary text. In a communication paradigm, four broad factors can be seen to have a bearing on the literary text. If we keep the literary text in the center, we have the author, the creator, we have the reader or the audience, we have the society, the external objects, and we also have history and culture. So if we look at these four and go about in more detail, we know that the four basic perspectives employed for the analysis of text, they focus either on the creator or on the author or on the society or on the history and culture. What are the implications? Suppose the focus is on the author. It is called a biographical approach, generally known as biographical approach. It focuses on the creator or writer in order to interpret a literary text in the light of the history of the author. Such interpretations tend to be biographical in orientation, and the method of interpretation has been termed as biographical method of criticism. This approach uses details of an author's life to analyze the work. It relies on autobiographies, it relies on biographical criticism. We have a scholar, Brett Millier. In her discussion of Elizabeth Bishop's One Art, she examines the text in order to see both how it works, how the work came into being, and how it might have been changed from the autobiographical origins, keeping them in mind. The difficulty with this sort of biographical approach is that fictionalized accounts, even when they have been inspired by actual events and people, generally change a great deal in the text. The literary text is definitely different. It is not entirely history of an author, or it is not a piece of the history of the author. There may be biographical facts which may serve as a kind of an impulse for creativity, but it does not mean that it is life, because this is created. The impulse is recreated artistically. so it does not remain what actually it is in real life. Sociological approach interprets texts in the light of facts of society that are represented in the text. These facts are comparable to social facts existing outside the text, that is, in real society, real life. Such approaches tend to be sociological in orientation and understanding. The understanding of a text takes place in the larger social context, where literary strategies are considered to be employed to represent social constructs. The sociological approach analyzes both how social facts function in literature and how literature functions in society. The form of literary criticism was introduced by Kenneth Burke, a 20th century literary and critical theorist whose article, Literature as Equipment for Living, outlines this method. And it finds this method very significant. According to this approach, works of literature are seen as strategic naming of situations that allow a reader to better understand the society, the happenings in the society through the work of art. If we focus on the history, the third one, then we have a historical approach. The historical approach seeks to understand a literary text by investigating the social, cultural, and intellectual context that produced it. A context that necessarily includes, of course, the artist and biography too, and the society too. A historical reading begins by exploring the possible ways in which the meaning of the text has changed over time. The analysis of William Blake's poem London, for example, can be said to contain certain words which had different connotations for the poem's original readers than they have today. The poem's associations with 18th century English readers would have created certain images and characters like the chimney sweeper, a type of exploited child labor who fortunately does not exist in the present society. So the meanings today of Blake's poem would be understood in a different way than they were done in the 18th century. So the historical approach focuses on this kind of change that takes place through history. Then focus on the reader gives us a reader response approach. The reader response approach focuses on the reader, focuses on the reader's experience of a literary work. This approach had begun in the 1960s and 70s, particularly in the US and Germany, and Holland, Fish, Iser, Jauss. There are many scholars who worked in this domain. Roland Barthes and others also took this approach for a while. This approach recognizes the reader as an active agent who imparts real existence to the work and completes its meaning through interpretation. It is the reader who completes the text. The text by itself does not have full meaning because the readers will create the meanings in their own way. So therefore the readers are very important for the reading and completion of the text. This is also called affective stylistics. Here the reader recreates his own experience of the text in the reading process. Stanley Fish is one scholar who talks about, according to affective stylistics, one of the proponents has been Stanley Fish. According to him, a text can only come into existence as it is read. And according to David Bleich, comparing a reader's interpretation with that of other individual interpretations is the way to arrive at a continuity of meaning. So one has to compare different readings and then only we will know what the text is about. These four approaches that I've just talked about, these four approaches focus on aspects all these aspects are outside the literary text. They are extraneous to the text. They are not intrinsic to the text. The text is text. It has a world created in language within it. If we focus on the reader is outside the text. If we focus on the creator is outside the text. If we focus on the facts of society, the real society is outside the text. If we focus on the historical paradigm is outside the text. So we are using all these four aspects which are external to the text, and because of this, these four aspects have been termed as extrinsic. This is an extrinsic approach to literature. That is, we are taking facts from outside the text to interpret the text. We are taking facts from outside the text to interpret the language of the text. Stylistics is different. Stylistics does not look at a text as an extraneous phenomena. The text is central. All extraneous phenomena is to be kept out. The focus on the text is intrinsic. We look at the text in an intrinsic way. The intrinsic look at the text involves looking at language of the text. After all, it is the language of the text which reveals the text. It is the language of the text which reveals the social life of the text. It is the text which reveals the poem I, the I who is a construct in the text. And it is the reader who is constructed sometimes within the text. All these are textual constructs. So we need to look at the language of the text and have an intrinsic approach rather than an extrinsic approach. So one point is clear, that linguistic stylistics is intrinsic in orientation, not extrinsic, like the biographical approach, like affective stylistics, like sociological approach, or like the historical approach. We come to the second point. What is the status of linguistic stylistics? We know that a purely grammar-centered linguistic theory will at best give us only the grammar of the poem or grammar of a text. It cannot give us the essence of the text. What is the text about? After all, people write texts. People write texts, people read texts, they enjoy them, they understand them. All that enjoyment and understanding is outside, so far, the analysis from the perspective of linguistics. The hidden meanings cannot be explained by present-day linguistics. So that's why we need to redefine linguistics. So in this context, there is a need for a global discipline of linguistics, which can study not only the linguistic structures, but also the functions of language, which would include even the artistic and aesthetic functions. So we need a language, we need a perspective to language, which will include all manifestations of language. And all manifestations would include literature too. And linguistics, being a discipline that studies language, should be able to study all dimensions of language, including the literary. There have been so far three broad views regarding the relationship between linguistic structure and stylistics and language. About stylistics, Roman Jakobson and Saporta, they considered poetics as a theory of linguistics. It's a part of linguistics. Even the pragmatic function has to be taken into account. They consider the pragmatic, semantic as part of linguistics. On the other hand, we have scholars like Winokur and René Vallée, who thought that linguistics is capable of studying language style only and not art style. They consider art to be different from language. Language style is only restricted to formal, informal, kind of a frozen style, informal style, casual style, intimate style, those kind of styles. But art style is out for René Vallée. The third view, which Srivastava propagated at the University of Delhi, and many scholars followed it, that linguistics is a global discipline and it overlaps with various areas. Language overlaps with psychology, language overlaps with art, language overlaps with other areas. So linguistics should be able to take over all these convergence areas. All these overlapping disciplines should be able to be studied by linguistics, including art. So linguistics should study all verbal aspects, including artistic dimension, including aesthetic dimension, and of course give a methodology for doing so. So there have been three views that I just told you. One, that poetics is part of linguistics. One, that it has poetics has nothing to do with linguistics. And third, no, it is much more. It is not only that, it should be able to answer everything that language has. Linguistics should be a discipline that looks at language in a global perspective. Now, what is this global perspective? We will also look at. So, what we can say is that there is a broad and narrow conception of the discipline of linguistics. Our approach is going to be a wider approach. In the wider sense, if linguistics is the global discipline that studies the various functions and uses of language, then stylistics becomes a part of linguistics, for it studies the literary function of language. If linguistics is defined in the narrow sense as the discipline that studies sentence-level language structures with the denotative meaning in the focus, then the domain of stylistics becomes narrowed down to applied linguistics. The domain of stylistics, as we envisage, it necessitates a linguistics which is global in orientation and which studies not only the structure but also the functions and uses of language. This has led to positing of some basic assumptions about language, because how we consider language will define our linguistics. So what is language? We look at language in a more broader sense, because language and linguistics has always been defined according to how language has been conceived. If language is thought of as consisting of sounds, then we have phonetics in the center. If it is considered to be only an accumulation of sentences, we have sentence-based grammar. So there are different perceptions about linguistics which will give us our conception of language, or rather different conception of language which will give us differing perspectives to linguistics. Now, coming to the basic assumptions. In order to understand language in all its dynamism, 5 basic assumptions are being suggested. 1, man's linguistic competence is inseparable from his cognitive faculties. 2, man's communicative competence refers to the totality of his communication resources. 3, man's communicative system is the contract social of the kind I-thou, involving a mediation process. 4, the basic unit of communication process is a speech event and not a sentence. 5, language is intrinsically a differentiated system. It is not a homogeneous system. It is a heterogeneous system. So if we look at these 5 points, then the study of language will be able to encompass all domains of language, including the literary. So language would be able to, wherever there is an interface with language, linguistics will be able to account for all those interfaces. So these 5 I will highlight a bit more. First, I had said that man's linguistic capacity is inseparable from his other cognitive faculties. What does this mean? This assumption stresses that human beings' competence to use language correctly and effectively is clearly defined by various social contexts. Competence is very much central to the theory of linguistics. If we have Chomskyan competence refers to only grammatical competence, competence that looks at language as a model consisting of sentences. But the suggestion here is linguistic competence is fine, but we need to see how language means in society, how people express themselves, how people understand each other. That goes beyond sentences. So what Delheims had mentioned was communicative competence. So what we need is, in addition to linguistic competence, a communicative competence, where the communication is understood by the two interlocutors. The second assumption was man's communicative competence refers to his total communicative resources. What does this mean? This assumption lays emphasis on human being as a sign-producing animal who produces signs for the transmission of messages, and all these messages are verbal as well as non-verbal. The most striking fact is that man-produced sign systems are organized like language. It should be noted that Saussure conceived the field of semiology, of which linguistics formed only one part. Recent researches in the field of anthropology, psychology, and culture studies reveal that symbolic dimensions of the rule-governed activity in each of the fields is patterned like verbal system. It is in this context that Roland Barthes had said, every semiological system has its linguistic admixture. In fact, we must now face the possibility of inverting Saussure's declaration that linguistics is not a part of general science of signs, even a privileged part. It is semiology which is a part of linguistics. The third point that we made was man's communication system is the contract social of the kind I-thou, and it involves a mediation process and intersubjective objectivity. What this means is that in a system of communication, we have a speaker, we have a hearer. The two understand each other in social context. Whatever A speaks, B understands, and B adds on to that or modifies that or gives an answer, and A understands. So this speaking between speaker and hearer with the interchange of roles, it is possible only because there is intersubjective objectivity between the two. There is much commonness, much social commonness, much linguistic commonness between the two. They can understand each other. This is a prerequisite in the communication paradigm. Now, given this prerequisite, what is language? In our actual language use, language consists of language signs that we speak, the verbal mode, the vocal sounds, the meaningful words, verbal. At the same time, when we speak in society, we also use our intonation contour, we use intonations, while asking questions, while exclaiming, while emphasizing. We do so many things. Even people we know sometimes whistle on the street, and even whistling has meaning. So different things can have different meaning. Even paralinguistic features have meaning. They are also very much part of language. Similarly, there are many non-linguistic facts which we linguists leave out. They are very important for communication. For example, the distance at which you stand and address a person shows the relationship, and that's meaningful. The kind of gestures that a person makes, the kind of facial expressions that one person makes, all these are meaningful. And sometimes meanings are conducted through many non-verbal signs. For example, in the Indian villages, in North India, women generally cover their heads as a mark of respect for the elderly person of the house. They cover their faces also at times. This has meaning. So it's a non-verbal thing. Covering the face is a non-verbal thing. Wearing a veil is a non-verbal thing, but it has meaning in society. It has great meaning in society. So if we look at this, then looking at the basic unit in communication process, we know that the basic communication process, basic unit is speech event. Given the speaker, given the hearer, given verbal interaction, given paralinguistic features, given non-linguistic features, all this comprising language. then how do we study language? Language will not be restricted to sentences because paralinguistics will be out, non-linguistic factors will be out. We need to include these because they are very much part of communication. So the basic unit is not a sentence, the basic unit is a speech event. So according to this assumption, speech event is verbal interaction. The speech event functions to sequentially organize units which are beyond the sentences. It is in this sense that Gleason had earlier talked about upward extension of linguistics, and Zelig-Harris had talked about discourse analysis, and Van Dyke had talked about text linguistics. So scholars had all the time felt that we need to extend the domain of linguistics from merely sentence level. The fifth part, language as a differentiated system. What does it mean? Language as a heterogeneous entity. What does it mean? This assumption stresses the fact that language variation is a rule rather than an exception to the natural condition of language. In this context, some scholars like Weinreich, Lebov, and Herzog have asserted that the very absence of language variation would make language dysfunctional. This implies that language exhibits sets of phonological, grammatical, and lexical variables which can be described quantitatively with reference to contextual features such as social class, age, sex, etc. We are familiar with William Lebov's work. It's in the same light. Socially relevant stylistic meaning is imported by the rules related to contextually relevant linguistic variables. So in light of these five assumptions, it is clear that a grammar-centered linguistics theory is not favored, since it strips language of its real social and communicative functions of language. It also precludes the study of paralinguistic and non-linguistic factors, which need to be included in any viable study of linguistics. Then it enables us to reach the social assumptions lying behind the utterance. It is in this context that a scholar, Burton, had said, a powerful method for understanding the ways in which all sorts of realities are constructed through language. This is necessary. So the kind of assumptions we have stressed about language take care of this. The study of the communicative intentions of literary text can only be achieved by a functions-oriented linguistic theory. Such a theory will view linguistic structures in terms of their textual functions. So what are the implications? The perspectives mentioned here regarding the nature of language, it makes possible for linguists to study all domains of language use, including the literary. Since language is viewed in terms of communication process, it becomes possible. So what are the implications of linguistic study of literature? The perspective mentioned so far regarding the nature of language makes it possible for linguists to study all dimensions of language use, including the literary. Since language is viewed in terms of communication process, it becomes possible for a linguistic study to study the literary intent of a text through functional study of the structures of the text. The language of a text becomes symbolic and needs to be comprehended through the context weaved in the text. The minimum unit of analysis in the speech event, it is the speech event. Dialogue is the basic unit, and speech event is a unit of the dialogue, and dialogue makes communication possible, not sentences. The interlocutors can be the poet, the dramatist, the novelist, etc. on one side, the listener, spectator, reader on the other. It doesn't matter. And gestures will be in drama. Gestures in drama can be interpreted meaningfully. Dresses will be interpreted, giving history. Distance maintained by actors will give us formality, and so on and so forth. So it becomes possible to study literature through a broadened approach of linguistics, which is based on the perception of language as a global entity. So what have you studied so far? What have you known so far in this module? What has been focused in this module is, number one, that we need to rethink about what is language. We need to include study of language. So let us summarize. What are the points that you are expected to know from this module? Number one, that there is a discipline called Linguistic Stylistics, which studies style, particularly literary style. Why? Because linguistics generally leaves out literature. And the basic fact is, all literature is constructed in language. No literature is outside language. Since it's a linguistic construct, we need a linguistic-based approach. Now, in order to develop this approach, we have to look at language afresh, language in broad terms. So we talked about 5 assumptions, which look at language in a global sense. Language is global. Whatever interfaces with language, linguistics should be able to account for that, including the literary. So we need a language in a global perspective, and linguistics has to be brought up. Upward extension of linguistics to include all the functions and structures of language. That is the kind of linguistics required. And linguistic stylistics is part of that kind of linguistics.